As we get started today, don't forget that the next primary source essay is due a week from tomorrow, and then the Rule of Faith essay is due 2 weeks. So it's before Thanksgiving. Make sure to complete that. The guidelines for that are available on Blackboard. If you have any questions, by all means, get in touch with me about that. We'll finish out the later Middle Ages today. Again, right around that 1200-year mark, but we'll extend a little bit past that. And when we pick up next week, we'll be looking at this kind of transitionary period between the Middle Ages and the Reformation that will take us to the end, and how things begin to happen from the year 1200 on that lead to some of the things that will blossom into the Reformation. Focus today is on church practice and some of the things that were going on in the later Middle Ages that deeply impacted how Christians worshiped, how Christians thought about worship, as well as new approaches to Christian practice. One very important development related to the actual worship of Christianity had to do with the question about questions about the Eucharist. Now, certainly the Eucharist or communion, the Lord's Supper, whatever terms we would use to describe it, had been a practice for centuries by this point. So as we're getting into the period from 800 to 1200, things have been around, and this has been practiced for almost 1,000 years. But in that first 800 years or so, almost 800 years, there hadn't been much discussion in any significant way about the symbolism related to the Lord's Supper and what Jesus meant when he said, "This is my body, this is my blood." There are some indications in various writings that some people possibly held an opinion that the bread and wine were more than bread and wine. That there was somehow Christ was present in the supper. But again, this was a minor reference, not anything substantial, and not anything that you could particularly focus on to say, oh, Christians in the 300s believed that Jesus' body was present in the bread. We've also talked about how there's a gradual transformation that takes place, moving conceptions about the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, from a table meal representing fellowship to the idea of the Eucharist and the Mass being one of sacrifice. First, the sacrifice of worship offered to God, but then also the idea of the Eucharist itself in sacrificial terms. And so as this develops, the idea of the real presence of Christ, physical blood, physical body, begins to be a part of certain conceptions of theology in the West. In the East, we'll see it's a little bit more complicated. Now, again, while some of these ideas, we can point to some places in some early Christian writings that might suggest this idea of real presence. The first person who does any substantial work on this, as far as what has been recorded, is a man named Cassius Radbertus, who writes a treatise called On the Body and Blood of the Lord. It's published in the year 834. Essentially, Radbertus argues that the prayer said prior to the Eucharist transforms the elements into the body and blood, the actual body and blood. But this transformation is not something that you could experience through the senses, right? Looking at it, you don't look at it being transformed. When you taste it, you don't taste something different, right? So when you take the wine, you don't taste iron or blood or anything like that. It still tastes like wine. It still tastes like bread. And so for Radbertus, though, there is a transformation that takes place. Again, it's not a completely developed idea where you can point to all the ins and outs, but this notion of transformation. Good.
Why did this matter so much? It could have been a matter of this is physically happening, or this is just symbolism for us to remember. In the end, what's happening is happening. Why did it matter?
Well, I think for a lot of people there is a desire for some people to just have concrete answers. And they want things to be explicit. And so as you start to get this idea of the Mass being a sacrifice, well, what does that mean? If the Mass is a sacrifice, what does that mean when it comes to these elements? How could bread and wine actually be sacrificial? So I think it's just trying to be specific about some things that, again, you're right. When Jesus says, "This is my body," right? "This is my blood," he does not say, "This symbolizes my body. This symbolizes my blood." Right? I mean, he says, "This is." Now, Jesus will also say, "I am the door for the sheep." And when Jesus says, "I am the door for the sheep," nobody believes that Jesus is, 3 feet high and made of wood. You say, "Oh, well, he's speaking metaphorically." But the question becomes, when he says, "This is my body, this is my blood," is he speaking metaphorically or is he speaking literally? Because if he's speaking literally, he would say, "This is my body, this is my blood." If he's speaking metaphorically, he could say, "This symbolizes my body, this symbolizes my blood," or he could say, "This is my body, this is my blood." Now, to kind of complicate this from a Protestant, non-Catholic standpoint, there are injunctions against eating blood, even after the New Testament. Right? That's one of the things that the Jerusalem Conference sends to the Gentile churches. They're to abstain from eating blood. But just like we see when we look at all these efforts to try and pin down exactly how Jesus is human and divine, for some people it does matter because they just want to know. Right? Vertus does end up convincing some people. The people that follow him are referred to as realists, and the body really becomes, for example. And so this is the first clear, substantial discussion about this. But not everybody accepts it in the West. And so King Charles the Bald asks a man named Reformation from the city of Corby to address this issue. For Reformation, it is not so much about the physical presence of Christ, but the spiritual presence. Christ is spiritually present in the elements. The elements are still physically bread and wine.
They kind of get that from possibly the verse, like, "I won't take this with you until we're in my Father's kingdom." I look at that as futuristic.
Yeah, I mean, that part is looking at it as futuristic. I think that largely they're saying, when Jesus says, "When 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them," right? So obviously Christ is spiritually present, but they're taking "this is my body" in a metaphorical sense. In an effort to try and address this, obviously Scripture isn't much help in the sense that both the symbolic understanding and the realist understanding could say, well, he says, "This is my body." Well, yeah, that's what he says, right? What does "is" mean? A couple of years ago, there was a big issue related to President Clinton, who had come under impeachment because of some inappropriate relationships with an intern. Right? He'd been committing adultery. And so one of the things resulted, one of the questions he was asked in his impeachment, President Clinton responded, "Well, it depends on what the meaning of is." So there was a big, to-do in the political press, of course, about, is means is. Okay, so when Jesus says, "This is my body," all right, everybody knows what "is" means, right? Well, yeah, but he also says, "I am the door of the sheep." Right? "I am the bread of life. I am the vine. You are the branches." Right? So metaphor can use the same words, as the realist view. So the appeal then was to, well, what did other early Christians say? And so people like Justin and Irenaeus. Ambrose was unhelpful. He simply said it is the body. Again, well, you're still kind of problematic. Augustine as well was very unclear. An abbot from Germany, Rabanus Maurus, tries to take a middle road. And so he would say, you can't say the bread is the historical body of Jesus. But when a person takes the Eucharist, the bread becomes the true body created again by God's power. And that's a very ambiguous statement, right? So it's not really his historical body, but it is the body of Christ recreated in the observance of the Eucharist. What also, of course, makes this complicated from a realist standpoint is that question of the physical boundaries of the body of Jesus of Nazareth. Apparently, from, I'd say, Acts chapter 1, it is the physical body that ascends into heaven. And so whatever plane of existence that heaven is on, Jesus is there in a physical body. So how does the physical body become present in the bread and wine of Catholics and a variety of churches across the world? It doesn't seem to necessarily fit. But of course, there's a lot of things within even traditional Christian teaching that those of us that are non-Catholics would accept that almost seems paradoxical, right? If you want to save your life, you must lose it. And so obviously there are challenges that can be overcome by God. Ultimately, the Fourth Lateran Council in the year 1215 ends on the realist view, which is the predominant Catholic view today, what is often referred to as transubstantiation, which means that the elements still appear to be bread and wine, but they are really the body and blood. However, there are, of course, individuals throughout the centuries who tend to be more on the mystical side, and we'll talk about mysticism here, who have claimed to have had visions of seeing the elements actually begin to look like body and blood. And we'll talk about people having visions of the bread bleeding. And then other types of things where they make this claim to try and emphasize the supposed veracity of transubstantiation. In the midst of all of this, it is Thomas Aquinas who becomes very helpful for the realist position by developing the theological language to make sense of this concept. We briefly mentioned this the other day when we were talking about scholasticism. There's that concern of trying to be very specific in your terminology. And so Aquinas distinguishes between the substance of something and its accidents or its appearance. The outside appearance versus the substance, which is the real qualities. For Aquinas, however, you can only perceive through the eyes of faith that the elements had been transformed. It was not something that you could see, smell, taste, and the other senses we could talk about. We'll talk about the Byzantine approach in a little bit. Any questions, any additional questions about this view of real presence?